But first, on multiple occasions prior to last year's election, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese promised, quote, a royal commission or some other inquiry into the pandemic. But the inquiry he's just announced into COVID that won't hold public meetings, that can't compel witnesses to appear, that can't subpoena documents, and that most notably won't investigate any actions by state governments, well, it's a whitewash. Now, as a broken promise, this is more blatant than his absurd commitment to cut your power bill by $275, given that so much that feeds into our power prices is actually outside government control. Yet the holding of a royal commission, or not, and what terms of reference it has and investigates or doesn't, well, that's entirely within the power of government. This isn't a promise he was forced to break. This is a promise the Prime Minister chose to break. And it's hard to avoid the suspicion that this is basically about letting Labor states off the hook. And, of course, stitching up Scott Morrison yet again, just as he stitched him up a little bit earlier over the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. Now, this is cover-up politics pure and simple for his Labor Premier mates, and it's get square politics for Morrison. And that's because, sure, the federal government spent upwards of $300 billion basically paying people not to work during lockdowns, and it turned Australia, of course, into a virtual prison island by closing our borders for the best part of 2 years, but it was the states that made our lives hell. Now, in Victoria's case, by making Melbourne the most lockdown city on earth, curfews, wouldn't even have them in wartime, 5-kilometre limits on where we could go, playgrounds closed, police firing tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters, plus the wretched incompetence of hotel quarantine. No one could remember, even after the event, who put it in place. Well, that cost 800 Victorian lives.
I can't specifically recall.
I can't recall. I presume I did.
I don't recall the conversation.
And I have some memory, but not full memory.
I don't recall specifically.
Not to my recollection. I have no recollection of that.
I can't specifically recall.
A cavalcade of incompetence. And it was the states that stole 2 years of the lives of young people by closing down schools and universities. It was the states that left old people to die alone, not even able to hold their family's hand because they weren't allowed to have visitors, supposedly for their own protection. It was the states that turned Australia from one country into 6 petty principalities.
People living in New South Wales, they have New South Wales hospitals. In Queensland, we have Queensland hospitals for our people.
Playgrounds, basketball courts, skate parks and exercise equipment, despite the fact that it's outdoors, will be closed.
People can walk the dog around the street. Don't talk to your neighbours.
Browsing is not allowed.
So please, when you open your front door, just think for a moment, do you really need to go out?
Obviously, school holidays are upon us, so we've based upon the advice of the Chief Health Officer, allowed for people to go on holidays, but subject to quite stringent rules.
If you are at Adelaide Oval and the ball comes towards you, my advice to you is to duck and just do not touch that ball.
There's a whole bunch of people down the Ryback Beach last night who thought the best thing to do was to go and watch the sunset. I'm sure it was a beautiful sunset, but that's not in the spirit or in the letter of these rules.
Now, it's a travesty that nearly all the hard stuff and the pain inflicted on ordinary people will now be off limits to the 3 functionaries that the government has named for this inquiry. One, I might add, a former Labor Chief of Staff who's highly political, making this whole exercise a joke. Despite the millions that this inquiry will cost, here's just some of the questions they won't be able to answer or be allowed to answer. The first one: why was the pandemic plan that had been carefully refined over 15 years, yes, I know about it because I was briefed about it when I worked for the then Prime Minister, why was that junked in the first week of March in 2020? Why was it scrapped? Because if it had been followed, there's every reason that the lockdown harm might never have occurred. Did any health benefits of lockdowns, did any health benefits arise that justify their enormous and ongoing economic cost? Was it health science or political science that dictated government decisions? What justified the vaccine mandates? Vaccine mandates, I might add, that even now are still keeping firefighters out of work in New South Wales and Victoria. Why did Victoria reject the help of the military and decide to go it alone with private security, pay tens of millions of dollars to manage and botch up hotel quarantine? Why was New South Wales so far advanced in computer-based contact tracing, while states like Victoria, well, they still operated a pen and a paper and a fax machine system? Why did the Morrison government waste $70 million on a contact tracing app that proved worthless in practice? And why shouldn't Australia have followed the example of Sweden, the one country that stuck to the original pandemic plan, with hardly more deaths per capita and certainly vastly less social and economic costs, rather than what we instead suffered by locking down the country for almost 2 years? Now, I get the pandemic was a wretched, miserable time for most of us, and we'd all rather forget it. Forget it, me included. I mean, I lived every day of the lockdown in an apartment in the inner city of Melbourne, so I get it. I get it. But there will be another pandemic. It's not an if, it's a when. And next time, we must handle it better. And it's just criminal that this junk inquiry is about what's best for Labor and not what's best for our country.